start in just a second here. I'm going to erase the board.
Yeah, I'll take it up.
All right, next slide. See where we're at. So I want to finish up these slides and start the next batch of slides, which covers pituitary. First, generically, I want to talk about how glands are stimulated in the first place, generally speaking. And there's three modes of how glands are stimulated: humoral, neural, hormonal. So the basic idea here is, if you look at the top picture, the image I showed you to start with, this is the endocrine cell. What stimulates it to secrete the hormones in the first place? There has to be a mechanism. And let's go through these. We have nice figures in the book to help you understand that idea. Endocrine glands can be stimulated humorally. Basically, blood levels of something are detected by glands. Three ways to stimulate endocrine glands. One, the blood level of something. So then you have a blood vessel here. A lot of things circulate in the blood. In the example of calcium, calcium is important for muscle function, cardiac and skeletal muscle function. So its level has to be maintained. If it gets low, that will trigger the parathyroid glands to secrete something. Low calcium levels. Parathyroid gland. It stimulates, it detects the low calcium levels. So it'll secrete a hormone called parathyroid hormone. On the figure, it's abbreviated PTH. It'll target some cells, I'll tell you later, but ultimately, if the imbalance was low calcium, the action of PTH is to raise calcium. I'll tell you how later. The point of this part of the lecture is what stimulated the parathyroid, a level in the blood. There are other examples we talked about today. You could talk about the example of low sodium. We did that before the break. That level will trigger the release of from the adrenal cortex. The zona glomerulosa is what we wrote before. It'll secrete the hormone aldosterone to help raise sodium levels in the bloodstream. On that sugar figure I showed you at the start, I didn't do it, but if you had low glucose, I did insulin, but the one that raises glucose levels, not lowers it, is the hormone glucagon secreted by the pancreas. Glucagon is a hormone that can raise glucose levels in the blood. So, three examples, three easy ones of blood levels stimulating the endocrine gland in the middle. Okay, that's one way you can stimulate a gland. Another way, shown in this video here, this is the only example I know of, you can stimulate an endocrine gland with a nerve. Okay, these are sympathetic efferents. that stimulate the adrenal medulla. So the second way is number 2, neural stimulation. Sympathetic efferent, which stimulate adrenal medulla. Adrenal medulla. I'll give a more extensive talk about the adrenal gland later, but just to kind of give you a preview. The adrenal gland, this whole thing, is compartmentalized. It's basically your stress response organ, but the outer part, like from here to here, all the way around, that's the cortex. The inner part is called medulla. So you have to differentiate from adrenal cortex, adrenal medulla. Cortex means bark. It's always the outer part in anatomy. Medulla means pith, pithy. It's like internal. Okay, well anyways, this example, you're stimulating the adrenal medulla. Now, if you remember your autonomics, there's always a preganglionic and a postganglionic nerve cell, okay, a neuron. Here's the preganglionic. Where's the postganglionic? There isn't one. This is that example where instead of a postganglionic neuron, you have the gland is actually the postganglionic, and it secretes catecholamines into the bloodstream for the stress response. Secretes catecholamines. That's a long, fancy word. It used to be called adrenaline, right? Now it's called epinephrine, norepinephrine. Those are the catecholamines. So those are the, when you exercise or when you get scared in a stress response, you have neural stimulation of the adrenal medulla. That's another example of stimulating a gland. You have many examples of hormones stimulating the release of other hormones. And the pituitary is a great example of that. In fact, I'm going to teach it pretty much next. And so let's kind of learn what this figure is showing us. It's showing us that at 3 levels, you're getting hormones stimulating the release of other hormones. At the hypothalamus level, at the anterior pituitary level, and at this lower gland level here. Hormonal stimulation. One definition to know, whenever people use the term tropic hormone, spelled tropic, pronounced tropic. A tropic hormone is a hormone that controls the release of another hormone. I guess the opposing word is like direct action hormone, put that in parentheses. If the hormone actually affects the target cell to do the physiology, that's direct action, right? You're not just releasing another hormone. For example, ADH, it facilitated water reabsorption. That's direct action. Aldosterone, you get the sodium reabsorption. It did it. The sodium reabsorption was triggered by the aldosterone hormone. That's direct action. Here, we're talking about you're just releasing another hormone in a chain of events. So in this example here, the pituitary, basically the pituitary is stuck between hypothalamus above, and this it'll control the release of another hormone from an endocrine gland below. So hypothalamus, anterior pituitary, another gland. Hypothalamus, part of your nervous system structure there. Right below that, I'll put ANT-PIT for short. Anterior pituitary, and there may be some other gland below that. The first example they give is how you have pituitary control over the thyroid gland. The thyroid gland secretes thyroid hormone. It helps boost metabolism. I'll give you more facts on that later. But for now, let's learn this kind of chain of events that occurs, starting with hypothalamus. The hypothalamus starts it by secreting a hormone called corticotropin-releasing hormone. For now, we'll just abbreviate it CRH. Just know that that's a hormone that comes from this top level. And that CRH will stimulate cells in the anterior pituitary that will release another hormone called thyroid stimulating hormone. We'll just abbreviate it TSH for now. So again, here's our first example of a tropic hormone. CRH is a tropic hormone. It controls the release of TSH. Thyroid stimulating hormone targets the thyroid gland. It's in your neck, and we'll teach you that later, but it stimulates the thyroid to secrete thyroid hormone. So CRH, TSH are both tropic, right? They are controlling the release of another hormone. Thyroid hormone does the physiology. I'll teach you that later. That's kind of like the first example. Then they give the adrenal cortex as another example. Now that's in the kidney. Now to control that, the hypothalamus will secrete, I'm sorry, I made a mistake. One tiny mistake. Change that C to a T. Thyrotropin releasing hormone controls the release of thyroid stimulating hormone, thyroid hormone. I got ahead of myself because to control the adrenal cortex, it's CRH. I'll write the abbreviations all out later. For now, I just want to get the concept across. It controls the release of another hormone called ACTH. ACTH will stimulate the adrenal cortex to release other hormones, like aldosterone. Another one I'll teach you later is called cortisol, helps regulate sugar. All right, see if you're with me here. I'm just going to point. Tropic, yes or no? Yes. Tropic? No. No. Tropic? Yes, these first two are going to be tropic. The last example is gonadal stuff. Gonad. Either the ovaries or the testes. In the hypothalamus, the tropic hormone is gonadotropin releasing hormone. Capital G, lowercase n, releasing hormone. It'll stimulate the anterior pituitary to secrete FSH-LH. Follicle stimulating hormone, luteinizing hormone, just the abbreviations now. But those are the also called the gonadotropins. And they'll stimulate ovaries or testes to, well, depending if it's male or female. If it's male, the gonad will secrete primarily testosterone. Or if it's female, it could be estrogen or progesterone. Okay, so that's what that figure is teaching you. Hormones are being released and controlling the release of other hormones. Let's take a minute here, breathe, and I want to give you guys a chance to talk to each other and see if you can, like, for these 4 examples, tell me if they're humoral, hormonal, or neural examples. Take a minute, think about it, talk amongst yourselves, go ahead, go. I know it's the first day. You might have to introduce yourself and say, hello, my name is. That's okay. Break out your shell and just try to get some words out. All right, let me check back. Basically, one word answer for each of these. Number 1, just shout it out. What'd you put? Yeah, that's a good one. What about that one? That's neural. That's the only example of neural that you have to know. What about this one? Humoral, yeah, blood level. What about this? Hormonal, yeah, tropic hormone. So that wasn't too hard. And this kind of segues nicely right into what I want to teach next, pituitary. I want to start it, I won't finish it, but there's a lot to unpack in pituitary. There's a lot of hormones that it secretes. Open it up. So the first lecture was just a general introduction on how hormones work. So go back and study your notes. And now I want to go through all the endocrine glands and everything that they secrete, starting with pituitary. And the adult structure, it helps to talk about the embryology development. I usually don't do that too much in this class, but when it helps understand the adult form, I do it. So switch into a different set of slides. Basically, this is my second lecture of endocrine, but I'm starting it on the first day, so I don't fall behind. Pituitary is also commonly known as the hypophysis. So if you see that term, it's referring to the same thing. This slide is showing you the embryology development, about 3 weeks development. And basically what you're seeing is an upgrowth and a downgrowth. Upgrowth, downgrowth. That's useful to know. The upgrowth is the future anterior pituitary, and it's the different tissue. These are two different tissue types. The upgrowth is epithelial. Okay. Future and pit. The downgrowth is neural tissue. It's the future posterior pituitary. Post-pit. I'll give you the full names in just a second. And in the adult, fast forward to that, this picture on the left here, I give you the page numbers from the Atlas of Anatomy that I use. Okay. Again, the atlas we're using is the 3rd edition. That's what your page numbers will match up with. If you save money and buy an older edition, that's fine. You won't get the page numbers. You gotta find it yourself. I guess that's the price for saving money, right? Time. Find the pages yourself. I'll give you the ones for what I'm using. Arrow is pointing to the pituitary. Okay? And if you kind of look, if you remember your central nervous system, the grayed out area on this figure, that's like the intermediate mass of the thalamus, that's hypothalamus, and that gray tissue extends down to the posterior pituitary. Okay? And then that lighter tissue is the anterior pituitary. So hypophysis means, hypo means beneath. Hypophysis means to grow under. You can see why they call it that. Right? Here's a superior view of the cranial base. Okay? And that space is where the pituitary sits. That's called the sella turcica. You should know that. Adult pituitary. Located in the sella turcica. That's of the sphenoid bone. Sphenoid. All right, so I put that picture from the previous slide next to an histology image on this slide here, and sometimes I turn off the lights so you can see better. And we have different regions of the anterior pituitary here that I'll go through. The one thing I want you to get straight so you don't get confused, because it is confusing, I want you to know how the tissue stained on an histology slide. This is a real tissue. This is an illustration. The anterior pituitary is region number 1. It stains dark, right? However, don't get confused, the illustrator chose to illustrate it light. And that may be how it looks on fresh dissection, but when we stain slides with literally like Easter egg dye, right, they take up a dark stain. Notice that area 2 is the posterior pituitary or posterior lobe. That stains light, not to be confused with the illustrator who chose to illustrate it dark. Okay, you got to know what you're looking at. Don't just say, "Oh, you said it stains light." Oh, so that's not light. So you're trying to hold me accountable. You're just wrong. I'm sorry. Look where it goes to. Okay, that's the part that extends from the brain. Okay. So you can see how number 2 extends up to the brain. Number 3 is the infundibulum or connecting stalk. There's a little region here in the form. Typically it has an intermediate stain, not in this picture, but the part in between 1 and 2 is pars intermedia. So let's turn the lights back on and write all those terms out. Area number 1, I call the anterior lobe here. I usually call it the anterior pituitary. It's also referred to as the pars distalis. It's also called that. It's also called adenohypophysis. Now there's a lot of cells that secrete a lot of different hormones for us, and let me just write them all out for you. I gave you abbreviations before. One, secretions, these are hormones, tropic hormones, is thyroid stimulating hormone, abbreviated TSH. Know the full name and the abbreviation, both are used on your tests. Another is adrenocorticotropic hormone. ACTH for short. Another is follicle stimulating hormone and luteinizing hormone. Check those out. Go over here. Follicle stimulating hormone, luteinizing hormone, FSH, LH. Think of those as a duo. They're both gonadotropins. Growth hormone is another. Abbreviated GH, and then prolactin. In females, PRL is the abbreviation. Those are the secretions of the anterior pituitary. Well, we'll talk about the physiology later. I just kind of wanted to get them on the board. That's area 1. Now, the posterior pituitary, area number 2, before I move on, let's remember, in a histology slide, this area stains the darkest. I would put that somewhere in the notes. Area number 2, posterior pituitary. That's what I mostly call it, but you should also know the alternate names. Pars nervosa, because it's an extension of the brain, basically. Neural hypophysis. That's about all I've seen it called. Two secretions, ADH and oxytocin. ADH I already wrote out, antidiuretic hormone. Earlier we called it also vasopressin, one and the same. The other one's oxytocin. I'll tell you its physiology later. I just want to list all the secretions of these two major regions. So this region stains the lightest. It contains axons, and axons are myelinated typically, and they don't take up a stain very well. So these stain light. That's how you can identify one region from another, which is what you'll have to do on a quiz. All right, so the third part, infundibulum, is basically an extension of the infundibulum extends down into posterior pituitary. Think of it that way. It's also called the pituitary stalk. It's a connecting stalk. No secretions. It just connects down into the, the posterior pituitary. There's one secretion for pars intermedia. There's no other alternate names that I'm aware of. And can't see it from this image, but usually the pars intermedia has an intermediate stain between the light and the dark. How convenient. Well, the one secretion that may come up is called melanocyte stimulating hormone. MSH, that's the hormone that stimulates, well, the melanocytes are in the integument, helps give the skin UV protection, melanin. So if you haven't figured it out by now, there's a lot of hormones to know for this chapter. Yeah, that's why it's a good chapter to have. They're all in there. You just go through them as a student, know what you do. Let me turn the lights off. There's some histology images here that I've put from pictures that I've taken. Okay, got that right. I'll do the same for you on Wednesday, but I just kind of took a picture from a previous semester and threw it in here, and I used a low mag. Our microscopes have 3 magnifications. I just call it low, medium, high, but really it's 40x, 100x, 400x. Okay, so 40 to 400 is basically our range. This is a low mag. This is like a 40x. What we can see, I've got it labeled, right? That top one, what are you going to call it if I say identify? Yeah, it's labeled. Well, it's not much of a quiz. Anterior pituitary, pars intermedia, posterior pituitary. Now, see the little sliver? That extends all the way down to here. Because it's a little stalk and the lobe is more roundish, it depends where you made the cut, right? If you didn't cut right down the center, you're not going to see the whole thing. You might see a little sliver. That is the infundibulum right there. All right, so this is more like a quiz. So this isn't really showing it, but what am I trying to indicate right in the middle? For the green arrow here or here? Pars intermedia. Identify what the red is pointing to. That's posterior. That's anterior. And what's the purple line here? Yeah, that's the stop ring from the infundibulum. Not really shown on this image. That wasn't too hard. The histology of it. The physiology is more dicey. And I think this is a good place to stop. If I start to get into it, I won't finish it and it's kind of interrupted. So I guess you get to end a little early. Normally the class ends at 10:50. If I end early, feel lucky, I guess. Now, remember, I botched the schedule. Don't judge me yet. And this is the first day. I'll get better. You can judge me in December. Right? Look for the revised schedule on campus, and I'll see you Wednesday.
How are you?